Hi there, friends. Welcome back to Sewing with Sin. It's been a while. I am here today to share with you what a lot of folks on Instagram have been asking me for. So if you don't know, I have been working on a dress called La Lupita Chiquita, and it's a small children's version of the adult dress pattern that I released in September this year. Last year, September 2023 is when that dress was released. And now I'm working on the children's version. So the children's version is the same as the adult. It's a pinafore style wraparound dress. So it's open on the sides. It has two ties that tie around the back and two ties that come around the front. And I just finished this dress, so I wanted to show it to y'all so you can see what it looks like if you do not want to do a fully lined dress. This is the alternative option, and you'll be using bias tape. So let me show you what the dress looks like with bias tape, and then I'll walk you through how I did that. Okay, so here's the dress. You'll notice that the neckline is used with bias tape facing, and I also used bias all along the side seams. And the type of bias that I used is double fold bias. So let me show you what that looks like. It's folded in half like this, but when you open it up, it has the two pieces folded in like this. So this is why it's a double fold, because you'll be placing it on the outer and the inner part of the bodice. So of course you could do a single fold as well, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I used double fold. And since this was the first time that I've made my own bias, I will also link in the notes below the video that I refer to for how to make this, and you can use that as a reference as well. Okay, so I have my front and back bodice, and at the shoulder seams, you're going to want to either serge or zigzag them stitch so you can press them open. And then you're going to want to mark with either a tape or a washable marker the back side of your bodice. And then with the wrong side of the bodice facing up right at the center, you're going to fold the bias in by about 1/4 of an inch and then place the raw edge to the raw edge of the center bodice and then pin in place. And then you'll pin your bias from raw edge to raw edge all the way around that neckline. And then just right over here when you get to the shoulder seams, making sure that they're still pressed open as you pin on top. And then when you get to the point where you started, you're going to want to overlap that bias on top of the original point by about 3/8 of an inch, and then pin it in place on top of where you started, and then trim off the extra bias that you're not using. And then you'll sew right on top of that first line on your bias tape. For me, that's at 3/8 of an inch. It just depends on how wide your bias is. And just continue to sew all the way around the neckline. And then this is what it should look like when you fold it over. There should be no raw edges showing from the other side. Now you're going to want to trim the extra seam allowance. Careful not to cut into the seam that you just sewed. All right, now with the right side of the bodice facing up, you're going to bring the bias up and over and fold it right on top of that seam line and pin it in place. All right, I'm at the back of the bodice now where the overlap happens with the bias. You're going to want to fold all your raw edges in, and then when you lay it on top, just make sure to tuck everything in nice and neat so the raw edges are not exposed. If you're using cotton or linen, it won't be as finicky as this fabric is that I'm using, but just take your time with this part right here. And then you're going to edge stitch your bias in place. I am doing it from the right side of my bodice. Alternatively, you can flip it over and stitch in the ditch from the wrong side. Just for the sake of accuracy for myself, I am doing it from the right side of the bodice. Here's what it looks like from the right side and the wrong side. And let's move on to the side seams. Okay, I've laid my bodice with the wrong side facing up, and I'm going to start on the back side. And I'll grab the wider tie and place it on the back bodice with the raw edges facing the raw edges of the bodice. And I'm going to pin it in place right along those notches. And then I'll get the smaller, more narrow ties and do the same thing to the front side of the bodice, pinning the raw edge to raw edge. And again, I'm working on the wrong side of the bodice. And then I'm going to get my bias and open it up on one side and start at the very edge of the bodice and start pinning it in place along that straight edge. Then when I get over here to the corner where it's about to bend along the side seams, I'm going to get a pin and pin it in place at a 45-degree angle. So it's going to be pinned diagonally. And one way to check if you have it pinned diagonally is just fold over the bias and see if you can see that angle right there. And then we're going to take it over to the machine and sew right up to that diagonal point. Here you're going to sew along that first line on the bias right up to the point where that 45-degree angle is. And I'm just taking it really slow right here because you're also sewing over the tie. And I just want to make sure that the tie doesn't move at all as it's going through the machine. And right when you're about to reach that angle, you're going to stitch really slow and then backstitch and cut your threads. All right, this part is a little tricky, so take a deep breath. You're going to fold over the bias on top of that pin, hold it in place, and then fold it over again. Now you're going to place your raw edge of your bias tape to the raw edge of the bodice. And I'm just holding it in place with my finger. Of course, you could put a pin right there as well. And what you're going to do is you're going to sew from that point where you stopped sewing, which was right where that needle was. I'm keeping my needle in, but in just a second I'm going to remove it. So I'm just finding the point where I stopped sewing just a second earlier, removing my pin, and then placing the needle down right where I stopped sewing. And you're going to continue sewing along that line of the bias tape. And I've linked a video below by Melly Sews. She's one of my favorites for tutorials. She has a bunch of different tutorials with bias tape. And the one linked below is working with corners and straight edges with bias. So I hope you find that helpful as well. And then right here at the shoulders, make sure that the seams are open before you sew the bias on top. All right, and here's that edge again, where you're going to be folding your bias at a 45-degree angle. So I'm just going to model it once again because it's kind of reversed this time. You're going to pin it in place right at that edge at a 45-degree angle. And I'm using the pin as my gauge to showing me where I need to stop sewing. So I'm going to sew really slow right up to that point of the pin. That's right at the edge of the bodice, and then backstitch and cut the threads, take it out, and fold over the bias on top of that pin, hold it in place, and then fold it right back down along the raw edge of the side of the bodice. And here I'm just holding it down with my finger and making sure that it goes over the tie. And then I'm going to start sewing right at that pin where I had stopped sewing previously. And make sure that the tie is straight. Sew all the way down to the bottom of the bias, backstitch, and then trim off the extra bias. Now, before you start folding over the bias, I recommend trimming off the bulk that's right where the ties are at. So that would be on the front and on the back. And just like with the neckline, you're going to bring the bias, wrap it around to the right side of the bias, and overlap just over that seam line that you just sewed, and pin it in place. So here's that point where we sewed and had the pin at the 45-degree angle. You're just going to pop it out and roll it over to the right side of the fabric, and it creates like a little fold on the opposite side, as you can see right here. And then you're going to pin that fold in place. Again, my fabric is a lot more finicky. Hopefully you're not using something like this for your bias. It will be a lot easier if you're using cotton or just any stronger fabric than what I'm working with. And then you'll continue pinning all along the side seam, making sure that the bias is going right on top of that seam line that you originally sewed. And from the right side of my bodice, I am edge stitching the bias in place and removing pins along the way. Now I'm just going to secure the straps to the bodice by pinning them down in place. This is from the right side of the bodice, and I'm just going to stitch about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the bodice. So I'm doing that for the front straps and the back straps. Now for this final top stitch, you can go all the way from that edge of the side seam, but I'm just choosing to add a top stitch right above the tie. So you can either do it along the side seam or just over the tie. Now, when you're attaching the skirt to the bodice, you can finish your seams now. So you could finish the seam separately on the skirt and separately on the bodice and then sew it together. Or you can sew the skirt to the bodice and finish all the seams together. So I'm going to show you what both of that would look like. So here you could see I finished the seam separately, and then I'm going to attach it together and sew the bodice to the skirt, and then I'm finished. On the opposite side, let me show you what that looks like. So on this side, I finished the seams with the skirt and the bodice sewn together already, so you can see that it's one seam finish. And then on the opposite side, I finished the seams separately and then I attached the skirt to the bodice. And that's what it would look like if you did it that way. I just wasn't sure if it was going to be too bulky, so I wanted to test both those out. All right, y'all. I hope that was helpful for you. If you sew La Lupita or La Lupita Chiquita using this method, let me know if it was helpful for you or if there's anything that you felt was lacking or that I can add to this tutorial to help folks out. Happy sewing!